Hello all. Hello all. Hello everyone. I know it's been a little bit of time since I've posted a video. Adult life is just kind of catching up to me a little bit and I just needed to take a step back. The last Transformers video was just a little overwhelming. It took way longer to edit than it should have, and exporting issues, so on and so forth. All on top of the fact that I'm starting a new job that's kind of been getting the better of me, but that's not important. We're here to make a video, so let's make a video. I know I say this a lot in the intros to some of my videos, but there is a lot of background noise. I'm just gonna have to deal with it, and I don't want to be recording in the dead middle of the night again, so we're doing it this way. But to get into the topic of today's video, I'm sure you've noticed a big trend lately. I say lately, but it's really been for the past 5-10 years. Remakes, whether it's movies, video games, music, comic books. I do have a script in front of me, but I'm not following it all too much. I kind of wanted to just sit back and do something a little bit more simple, maybe something that won't be extremely difficult to edit. But remakes have kind of been taking over pop culture media lately. Whether the quality of these remakes are good or bad, we're getting them regardless. Movies are probably the best example, as those who are kind of feeling that comic book movie fatigue. We're just getting reboots after reboots after reboots. And while there are some good movies and good gems popping up here and there, it's just a little exhausting. You know, when I do go to movies, I do try to aim more towards the more independent movies, things that might not always end up on streaming services and might have a very unique experience to the movie theaters. I'm not really feeling that itch with comic book movies these days, unfortunately. But we're actually not here to talk about movies. We're here to talk about video games. Remakes in video games is not a new thing, but more recently, video games have kind of crossed over this line where remakes for video games, depending on which games they're remaking, might actually be a good thing. The best two examples were obviously from just this past year with both the remake of Dead Space and Resident Evil 4. Now, I'm obsessed with Dead Space. I have been ever since I was introduced to Dead Space 2 years ago. I replayed the entirety of all three games. I say all three, there's more than just three games, but the three main games. I read, the comic books, the novels. I frequently dive into the lore just to, refresh my memory. Even if there wasn't a Dead Space remake, I'd still be heavily invested into the franchise, but I'm glad they did it. It is a game that, while the gameplay has aged well and the horror elements have aged well, the graphics have obviously not aged all that well. But regardless, as much as I love the Dead Space remake, they have announced some other remakes going through the pipeline, but I've noticed that a lot of them are big name titles, or they're things that in some way, shape, or form have had success in the past, probably running off of the momentum of things like Dead Space and Resident Evil 4. And that's all well and good, but sometimes I just feel like there's other franchises out there that always had a very redeemable quality, but for whatever reason, whether it was sales, poor quality gameplay, graphics, whatever it is, or maybe it just didn't get the attention it deserved at the time, or it was overstepped. Again, whatever reason it might have been, there have been countless games that have kind of just been pushed off to the side, forgotten. I think some of those games would do even better today. I do have a list here. No, I'm not ranking them. This is not like a top 10 game ranks or Watch Mojo thing. This is just me talking about a few games that rather I grew up with, I've heard about, I've read about, but I just can't help to think, what would that look like now? These are all purely hypothetical, obviously, because some of these games I'm kind of pitching that other developers make them, or how they could change up each game. I have no idea if whatever I'm saying makes any sense. Like I said, I'm not following much of my script today, but let's get into it. So the first game that I want to kind of get out of the way is Anthem. I know Anthem is kind of a big, I don't know if you would call it a controversial subject, but Anthem was just one of those games that, it had great visuals, it had great traversal gameplay, and a lot of great qualities that ended up just being covered up by all of the really poor things about the game, such as microtransactions, the fact that when you're exploring the world, there's like no life to it. It's really just a big, empty, beautiful landscape that's just got enemies everywhere. There's no like interactable life or other villages or side quests everything's just kind of monitored from the hub, and you kind of just select an objective, and then you go out into the world and you repeat the same missions over and over and over again. I know there's countless other things that are wrong with the game, but those are just some of the main points that I wanted to get over. I think now would be a great time for EA to maybe look back into Anthem again, especially with the success of Cyberpunk 2077 getting its 2.0 release, where they essentially fixed the game and they made the game that everyone was kind of expecting right from launch. And even though it took a couple years to do that, it's paying off. You know, Cyberpunk's right back into the spotlight, everyone loves it, and maybe EA could be like, hey, we could do the same thing with Anthem. They could rip out all of the pay-to-win type stuff, all of the microtransactions with cosmetics, fix the loot box system, maybe flesh out the open world a little bit. It wouldn't even have to be a remake. They could just make a sequel with all of the empty stuff from the previous game fixed. So it wouldn't even have to be Anthem 2.0. It could just be Anthem 2. Just do a sequel. And it's not like they would have to work from the ground up again. There were still a lot of great qualities that they can recycle for a future game. But again, that's not one of the games that I really wanted to talk about. So let's jump into the next game. This one's a very specific choice, is Zone of the Enders. I don't know if you guys remember this game or if you ever played it. I mean, it would be a little understandable seeing how old the game is, and when I was introduced to this game years ago, it was by one of my much older brothers. So maybe you haven't heard of this game, maybe you have, maybe I should stop talking. But the reason I bring up Zone of the Enders is not only is it a breathtaking story and has so many great qualities, mainly in the narrative, it kind of was one of the games that really blew up mech games. And one of the reasons why is because there were a lot of mech games like Armored Core at the time, but Armored Core has always kind of taken a step back from the narrative aspect. If anyone's played the new Armored Core 6, you kind of know what I mean. There might be a cutscene here and there. You never really see people. All of the story building stuff is cut between missions with voiceovers and phone calls, but Zone of the Enders did not do that. It was almost like watching an anime that you got to play. I'm not entirely sure if Konami would be the one remaking this game. I don't see why they couldn't, but Hideo Kojima was also, you know, part of that business at the time. So I'm not entirely sure if maybe there would be some way that the new Kojima Productions could take over the rights to Zone of the Enders. I'm sure there's a lot of business, political stuff that would have to go into something like that, but now would be a great time to maybe consider doing a game like Zone of the Enders, only because Armored Core 6 has pulled in such a bigger audience than Armored Core used to have. Both old and new fans of the franchise have been talking about Armored Core and been playing it and enjoying it so much since its release that it's kind of baffling, because that was kind of a game that I would bring up from time to time in the past few years that no one really cared for, even though it was a FromSoft game, and now everyone's talking about Armored Core. This would be a great game for Konami to just jump back into the ring and maybe use Zone of the Enders to kind of combat with Armored Core. Not that it is a competition, but why not? I would actually love to see what Hideo Kojima could do with Zone of the Enders now that, you know, he's got control of his own game studio. But who knows? Honestly, I just want to see Jehudi again. It was definitely my favorite mech growing up. Oh, and another idea I was thinking about is that this game, there were originally two games, Zone of the Enders and then Zone of the Enders The Second Runner. But I actually think that if they were to reboot the franchise or do a remake, they could start with The Second Runner. The second game holds enough on its own that it could easily be the beginning to a rebooted franchise, and they could just hint back to the first runner as he pilots the Vic Viper. I believe that's what it was called. And plus, the second game was, as far as I know, the more popular of the two anyways. It had a cleaner narrative, the cutscenes weren't nearly as long, and the antagonist was just a little bit more interesting. He was kind of that like rough and tough kind of character, aside from the 12-year-old boy you played as in the first game. But anyways, let's get on to the next game. And it's another game that definitely got forgotten in time, but it's LAIR. I don't know if you guys played this game. I actually never played it. I kind of came across it while doing some research from, old and forgotten games. And this game is actually really interesting, or at least on paper, because it was one of the launch games for the PlayStation 3, and they wanted to utilize the motion controls in the PlayStation controller so that you can steer the dragon. It's another thing that hasn't aged all that well. It wasn't something that was used very often, and as you can probably tell seeing that is that this game just wasn't all that great. It's not much to remember. But I do think that now, like these other games, would be a great opportunity to try this game again. Start from scratch, flesh out the narrative a little bit, rebuild the world that they tried to establish. And another thing that I was thinking about while doing some research on this game is a different studio that could take it on. It's still a PlayStation exclusive studio, but Santa Monica Studios. They have a huge success with God of War. They've talked about doing other games in the past, and I actually believe they are working on a different game. I could be wrong. But this game, and it, if you've played any of the God of Wars, especially the two most recent releases, they would knock it out of the park with character design, cinematic sequences. But I can't help to think of the dragon sequence from the 2018 God of War, how something like that would look, but for the entirety of a game. As a dragon rider, and having a dragon companion and being thrown out into big heavy battles and being able to hop on a dragon and take out a bunch of enemies. Maybe this game would step back a little bit from having such wide open plains and maybe kind of use the God of War formula a little bit and make a more linear story, and the dragon riding would be very story driven sequences, maybe even quick time events, just so that they don't have to worry about making these big clunky battles like the original game kind of had the biggest issue with. I just think the potential is there for a game like that. Also, keep in mind, whenever I'm talking about games, whether it's like remakes, remasters, or just the idea of choosing more forgotten franchises to remake, you could even say that about movies. Not to steer off too much, but Disney has the biggest problem with remaking stories that everyone already knows and loves. Like before the Beauty and the Beast movie came out, families were still showing their new kids the original Beauty and the Beast. That's a movie that would have never been forgotten anyways. But there are franchises or stories like Brother Bear and Treasure Planet that not as many people know about, but those are still great Disney stories and would work even better as remakes. More specifically, Treasure Planet. But anyways, I know I got through that game relatively quick. So the next game that I want to talk about is Vanquish. And yes, you might be someone to point out in the comments. Before you say anything, just hear me out before you leave a comment. Okay? Delete your comment right now. Yes, I'm aware that Vanquish, compared to some of these titles, is a more known name. It's not like a big AAA title. People still know a good amount of Vanquish compared to some of these other older games. Vanquish, while it is all well and good, I tried to replay it recently, even the remastered version that the studio put out for next-gen consoles, and it's still very bland. And the reason I say that, and I'm gonna use a term that's kind of been thrown around the past couple of years, is it's very video gamey. It kind of has like an arcadey kind of feel. And the reason I say that is because you kind of hop into a mission, maybe get 1 or 2 cutscenes, you take out a bunch of enemies, maybe do a boss fight, and then you get to a checkpoint where it gives you, a break in between missions and it grades you. While I know that that is popular amongst some games, Armored Core 6 being the most recent to do something like that, but I feel like it takes away from the experience, especially in the narrative of Vanquish, where it's a whole war going on and you get these random title screens that take you away from the experience a little bit. I just think that's something that hasn't aged well, and if you're gonna use it, you just have to use it for games that are more of an arcade style, not for a third-person shooter. And something that might also be a little bit controversial. Controversial. Whatever. Stumbling over myself now, is I don't think Konami, it wasn't made by Konami, Sega. I don't think it should be made by Sega. I think if Vanquish was to be redone, you know, they should just let go of the rights and maybe let a Western studio make it. I'm not trying to sound biased or anything, but I think Vanquish would pay off greatly if you kind of pulled it away from Japanese studios, which kind of have a weird stereotype about American action heroes. And I know that sounds really pretentious, but that's not the first time they've done that. There have been plenty of games, Metal Gear probably being the most successful of them, where Japanese studios kind of have a way to tell a story of a stereotypical like American action hero, which isn't bad. It's paid off before. I enjoy a lot of games like that, but I just think Vanquish, it comes off really corny. Sorry. So I don't have a particular studio in mind. I just think maybe any European or Western studio could pick up Vanquish and just redo it. They can implement a lot of the same gameplay mechanics, especially with all the quirks that come with Sam's suit, but just maybe, you know, add in a more fleshed out story and maybe even attempt a multiplayer. I think that's going a little too far, but it could be done. Sorry, Sega. I had no hate against you guys, but okay, before I keep rambling, let me move on to the next game. For anyone who's, you know, been watching my channel from the beginning, you knew, I told you I would bring this game up again, and that's Section 8. Unfortunately, Timegate Studio doesn't exist anymore. They closed down in 2013, but damn, would this game be so great today. It's another one of those games that it hasn't aged very poorly, but it just isn't popular enough. Not enough people played it back in its day. This game wouldn't even have to be a remake. They could do that, and they could just go in the remastered direction, but I still don't think that would sell all that great. They could do rather a remake or just a sequel. They could follow up with the story of Section 8 and mask it with a bunch of new graphics, new features, maybe even a new character, and try to pull the audience back into the Section 8 world. There are some first-person shooters that are great examples of what Section 8 could look like today, especially the most recent Halos and even Crysis back in its day. But Section 8 is just one of those games that if it was made today, and if it had the right marketing, and if it had the right studio and passionate developers behind it, it would be a home run. You know what? I've talked enough about Section 8, and I'm sure I'll bring it up in later videos. If you do want to hear me ramble a little bit more about Section 8, I have a video about it. Just go watch it. Not right now. Jeez, chill. Hold still for a second. Let's finish this video. I'm just joking. But seriously, let's move on. The next game that I want to talk about, and I was gonna make a whole video about this game, and who knows, I still might, is Army of Two. Now, the first two games were classics. I still own copies of the first two games. 40th Day is probably one of my most favorite cooperative games to play, especially the fact that, you know, it's a great game to play split screen. That's kind of the whole point of Army of Two. And I do love Devil's Cartel, but I can see why it didn't get the attention that Visceral Games was probably hoping for. Oh, and by the way, what happened there? How did Army of Two be switched over to Visceral Games, who was probably riding a high a little bit with Dead Space, and create such a lackluster version of Army of Two? What happened? I'm sure there's a lot of business related stuff with EA, which is kind of the whole reason Dead Space died in the first place, along with the studio's Visceral Games, but I just have so many questions that are not answered. Anyways, back to my point. Army of Two, I don't even think should have a remake. I'm actually going to use a word that was kind of introduced to me in one of the recent Scream movies, which is a requel. So essentially, what I think they should do is they should make a sequel to Army of Two, bring, you know, the audience back to that title, but kind of tell a story that restarts Army of Two at the same time. So you're kind of rebooting it, but it's still technically a sequel. A lot like what they're doing with Lords of the Fallen. It is a sequel, it takes place years later, but they're just kind of starting over at the same time with a new gameplay mechanic, so on and so forth. I don't know who would make Army of Two, seeing that it was passed on to Visceral Games closed. Or, here's an idea. Microsoft, look, your boy's got all of the ideas. So what you do is you reopen Timegate Studios, and you get, you give them a pretty good studio, get some passionate people in there. The first two games that they make, Section 8 and Army of Two. There, you've got two new exclusives. Who's winning now? definitely not PlayStation. That's actually a pretty good idea. You know, you're kind of rebooting a studio and giving them 2 titles to make, 2 new exclusives. I mean, I know there's a whole bunch of news with Xbox and the new exclusives that they're going to be getting, saying that they have Bethesda, but we're not getting into that. You know what? Now that I think of it, I do think that I might make an Army of 2 video. Anyways, let's move on to the next game. So the last game that I want to talk about, and it's another really specific title. I've tried to see if there's anyone I know specifically who's played this game, but the only other person that knows about it in my personal circle is my twin brother, is TimeShift. Again, don't know if you guys ever played it. Please let me know if you did. This was just kind of one of those games that I was looking through, you know, old Xbox 360 titles. The game has a very interesting idea. You know, it's one of the games that introduced first-person shooters that had time bending capabilities. It obviously hasn't aged all that well, especially seeing how old the game is, but there have been a handful of games that have not only proved in a technical sense, but in a narrative and even aesthetic sense of how successful a game like this could be now. Some of which being Titanfall 2, Deathloop, Quantum Break. I almost forgot the title of the name for a second. The game would obviously have to be redone completely from the ground up, and they might even have to redo the lore a little bit and change up the main character, as he was kind of boring, but the suit looked cool for its time. I would love to see what that looks like. I do have an idea of a studio that can make this. While they're probably not at the top of the food chain right now, Eidos Montreal. I know they're kind of their name is a little tainted right now because of Avengers, but we can't forget another great series that they're responsible for that would be a great foundation for what TimeShift could be, and that's Deus Ex. You know, the game has great mechanics, visuals. It's very aesthetically pleasing. It definitely has its own very specific art style and futuristic language that I don't know if any of that makes sense, but essentially there's a lot of creative potential there to redo TimeShift. So if anyone were to do it, they could. And it's not like anyone's really holding on to those rights anyways. I'm sure that's ripe for the picking. That's another game that I think we should talk about at some point, is Deus Ex, because it's another great title, but no one talks about it any, and I wonder why that is. Are they making a new game? But let's move on to Thaddeus?
How did you get over here? What the? You weird little man?
Anyway, so I'm sure it goes without saying, but I'm not like counting the days or holding my breath for anything like this to happen, or for any of these games to be remade or reestablished in any way. I could totally just have my foot in my mouth or something, because I wouldn't be surprised if maybe some of these larger titles like Army of 2 would be in the back burner for some studios. Like you, I am pretty tired of reboots and remakes. There are some that I'm looking forward to, like if they do happen to revitalize the Dead Space series. I would love to see what Motive does with that. They did such an amazing job with the first Dead Space game, and I would love to see what they do with my favorite being Dead Space 2. And another quick little idea, that they don't remake Dead Space 3, they redo Dead Space 3. You know, they write their own story, and they maybe even go back to what Visceral Studios was trying to do with some of their early tellings of Dead Space 3 and make one of those versions. Whatever, as long as they just don't remake the Dead Space 3 that we got. But again, we're not talking about Dead Space. Regardless of what I've said, I know this was kind of a lackluster video compared to what I normally do. It's just something I've been wanting to talk about. I didn't want to follow too much of a script today, as I say with the script in front of me. Did I use that bit already? I'm so tired. Luckily, this is Saturday for me, and I get to just relax a little bit after this. But please let me know what you think. Did you play any of these games that I listed? Would you like to see any of them remade? Do you have any other ideas of games that maybe you grew up with that you would like to see? And no, don't give me any of the ones that they're currently making or that are big name titles. Like, really dive deep. Tell me about some games that you grew up with that maybe you don't think someone else has heard about. I want to hear about it. Hell, maybe I'll play it. That's just a crazy idea. But please, like, comment, subscribe, ring the notification bell. I'm sure I don't have to tell you that this would be something I would love to do for a living. And quite frankly, I wouldn't be able to do it without you guys. So let's get there. I love making these videos. While they can be so difficult to shoot and edit sometimes, especially if I want to cut out some of this background noise and shoot at 2 in the morning, I'll do it for you guys. I just didn't want to do it this time. But goodbye to all of my pupils. Yeah, maybe I'll start calling you guys that. Please have a great one, and I will see you in the next video. No, what the hell were you doing? I don't understand. How did you get from there to over there? Are we just gonna have to keep having this conversation? It's ridiculous. No, I don't even want to look at you right now. Just jeez.